All right, so welcome everybody to FikaAI. My name is Stephen Shin, and I'm pleased to be with Brian Fox from Sonatype, CTO.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
At the DevNexus conference. So how are you enjoying the conference so far?
Yeah, love it as always. It's great to see new faces, see old friends.
Yeah, no, I mean, this has really been like a gathering of all the people.
That's right.
We know, kind of the decision makers and in the Java community and AI and new circles. And what I wanted to ask you some questions about is kind of risks with adopting like AI architectures and AI software. So kind of how you see that from your side, and then what companies or individual developers can do to mitigate that risk.
Sure. So, we look at the AI, explosion here. For me, it has a lot of echoes of what we saw with open source governance, 10, 12 plus years ago. The first problem was leaders were in denial that they were using open source. Same thing today. They'll say we have a policy. Our developers aren't using AI. We're not embedding AI, right? It's laughable because like I do, that's happening.
Yeah.
And it was exactly the same thing we saw with open source, forever ago. And so the first problem is awareness, understanding that it's actually happening. These models, like any other open source component, they have licenses that can have implications. There's copyright, legal implications. There can be security. There have been security instances. AI models are much more complicated than even, your typical open source component. So the risk there is even greater. But if you don't even know what you're dealing with, how do you even begin to control it?
Yeah. So like when you have development teams like using models they've downloaded from Hugging Face or trying to composite AI software, what are things they should keep in mind when they're downloading new libraries from repositories?
Need to be aware that they might have malicious code in it. They may have licenses that are binding your company to something that they wish they hadn't. They may be trained on data that can produce outcomes that might be embarrassing depending on how you use it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So like unlike code where it's you have the source code and that's all you have to worry about.
Right.
Now there's a data component.
That's right.
The
data component behind it. So the software could be fine, but somebody could have put a version in there that was trained, overloaded with a bunch of racist material, as an example, that suddenly pops up in your usage, right? And so, all of the traditional risk that comes with open source applies, and then plus. Now you have the data, you have the behavior. It's hard to be deterministic about what's going to happen. So whereas you might be able to get comfortable with certain open source components because you test the heck out of them, can you ever really test an LLM completely?
With AI models, it's tricky. So they're inherently indeterministic.
Exactly.
And you can test them to a certain extent, but even the tests are difficult, because you don't get back the same results.
That's right.
You often have another LLM evaluate the results coming out of your models.
That's right.
And there's a breadth of use cases because typically they're trained on such vast data sets.
Right.
That you just don't know all the different edge cases you even need to test for.
You don't know. That's right. And so I think that's going to put an increased focus on trustworthy components and trusting and knowing more about it, because you can't just scan it and prove that it's okay like you can in theory with open source. I mean, it's still important to know who's developing open source, who's behind it, but in theory you can review the pull request and get pretty comfortable with it.
Yeah.
With the AI stuff, you can't.
Reviewing a data set, reviewing embeddings, it's impossible.
You can't do it. So the trust element of that is going to become really important, right? So that's why we focused on same thing we've done for open source components, surfacing where they're used, surfacing the metadata about them so that companies can use the policy engine we provide to help reason about them, highlight the risk, disallow certain things, approve other ones. That's kind of how we're seeing it unfold.
Okay, yeah. So in other words, like you have to treat AI models kind of like you treat source code, where you have like security information, you have like verified sources for who's publishing it.
Right.
You're checking license compliance with open source licenses, and how many dependencies or like models would a typical project importer depend upon? How big is the dependency graph?
I don't have a good answer to that, honestly. I think it's all over the map, and I think what we're seeing is a surprising number of these models popping up in applications where people asserted they had none, right? So it's not just one, it's a handful of them for different bespoke purposes. And it's still a little bit, I think it's hard to define what normal is now. We're still in that super early wild west at the moment.
Yeah, and probably at a corporate level, like if you looked at all the different projects and you scanned their dependencies and their AI dependencies, that's a huge footprint that's undiscovered today.
That's right, especially the AI. I mean, look, so many organizations are still struggling with the log4shell issue because they don't have a good inventory of their open source components. This is an old, kind of boring problem. If you don't have the ability to understand where you're using log4j, good luck trying to figure out what's going on with the AI components in there. But if you think they're not there, you're almost certainly wrong. Unless you can prove they're not there, they're probably there.
All right, cool. No, it's great to chat with an expert in the field who actually understands open source and dependencies, and now like AI dependencies and how that impacts businesses. Also great to see Sonatype at the conference here at DevNexus. I mean, this is a great event. Huge number of attendees and actually a big focus on AI. So I give a talk about AI as well for the AI track. And anything else you want to kind of highlight or talk about that you guys are doing here?
We're sponsoring the coffee, so you can come get some coffee. But we're happy to talk to people about open source components, software composition analysis, actively malicious components. That's another area that people are still barely understanding. These components designed to attack your developers' development infrastructure, still a huge problem. And then, of course, understanding and governing your AI usage, all things we can talk to you about.
Cool. All right. Thanks a lot, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for
Great
having
chatting
me.
with you at the conference, and enjoy the rest of the interviews we have on FikaAI.